on my attention. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words upon now, it's made with good intentions.
Welcome to 1 or 200, the independent politics and media podcast. For this midweek episode, I am joined by Professor Mohan Dutta. Welcome to the cast.
Kia ora, Kyle. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad you reached out. Really looking forward to getting to quite a detailed conversation with you about the media and about the different narratives that are currently at play across the New Zealand and international kind of media framework. But maybe we just start with a brief introduction from you for our audience, so they know where you're coming from on this issue and on these details.
I'm so glad that we are having this conversation. We have gone back and forth chatting on Twitter, so it's really good to bring that onto this platform. Most of my scholarship is on looking at the intersections of whiteness, which is sort of the universal framing of white culture as the basis of norms and ideals, and how that shapes communicative processes, particularly in terms of what are the kinds of narratives we hear and what are the kinds of narratives that are erased. I am specifically interested in this question of erasure, tracing erasures in colonial contexts, tracing erasures at the raised margins of the capitalist systems, and then looking at the ways in which we can build voice infrastructures for those at the margins. So, all the way from experiments like community radio to media production spaces to theater-based spaces that work toward building those architectures for erased voices to be heard.
Thank you so much for that. And it's one of these, I guess, frameworks which has just drawn so much attention on you from the far right and from right-wingers in general, because it's so directly at odds with what they're trying to do in the communication space.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, part of it is sort of this idea that one can hold dialogue between, say, for instance, these white supremacist ideals and those who have systematically been erased is sort of the overarching ideology of the liberal apparatus, if you will. And that is what I describe as whiteness, the ways in which are taken for granted norms about dialogue and what is possible shape our conversations. And, what I have systematically found in my research is that in fact, those kinds of colorblind appeals to dialogue often actually perpetuate further violence and further erasure by, on one hand, performing some kind of representation, and on the other hand, continuing to uphold those hegemonic ideals that lead to the erasures without really questioning them. So I guess, the naming of this as whiteness is what triggers the far right, if you will, right? Because that work of naming it is seen as anti-civilizational or anti-white civilization, really what it is that's occurring there. But also it is seen as anti-democratic. So you're portrayed as either a terrorist or a racist for actually, naming that communicative process as whiteness.
Yeah, and you seem to get a lot of discourse around things like reverse racism, right?
Yes.
Which isn't real, which is just a justification for these attacks. I think for our audience members who aren't listening, a really good example, or who are listening but who haven't engaged in this discourse previously, a really good example of what you call whiteness versions of discourse would be civility politics, which you see weaponized again and again against Māori wahine here, especially in the political space, when they dare to be loud or speak out about something or push back on any of the abuse that they're getting every day.
Absolutely. I mean, we saw that with the Posey Parker protests, and with then Minister Marama Davidson, and when she talked about this idea of violence actually originating from this cis-normative white structure. Once again, she did the work of naming it as cis-normative patriarchy and whiteness, and that is what then brought about the backlash. And that backlash itself also, Kyle, in many ways is demonstration of whiteness in and of itself. So as you rightly point out, the politics of civility then pretty much disciplines what can and cannot be said. And in that process, therefore, marks out the other, which legitimately must be erased or which must not be heard because it is uncivil or it is beyond the realm of that can be heard. That act of policing, as you rightly pointed out, the works to erase the voices of Māori wahine, activists, politicians, educators. You see educators. I have seen educators being attacked in similar ways. I have seen activists being attacked in similar ways. And often with then, and this is the paradox of it, often with tremendous amounts of misogyny and violence. That is, so once you mark something as uncivil, that then becomes a justification for the misogyny and the hate, right? And we've also seen this, with Dr. Sapna Samant, who I have collaborated with her work at CARE, and she's an activist that does really amazing work on Hindutva. And, it's again an example of the civility politics of whiteness that, Tova O'Brien did piece that directly targeted Sapna in terms of the language she was using to talk about Hindutva, which is a far-right political ideology, and whiteness. And that then brought in fresh rounds of attack, both from white supremacists and Hindutva. So this is a perfect example where you see discursive construction in the mainstream, in the fairly mainstream media, and how that then links to white supremacist and Hindutva fascist attacks. That construction mobilized those attacks,
And it feels, when you see some mainstream media and some politicians indulge in this, it's at the best ignorance, right? They haven't done enough background research of their own or have enough background understanding to engage with these concepts in a way that is useful or even fair. And then there's this other real knee-jerk response to any mention of this stuff is just to call it culture war, or to call it identity politics. And you say that's genuinely not what it is.
And that's beautifully captured. And again, you see what is quite powerful to note there is the effect that it produces of silencing. So in the case of Dr. Samant, you have one of the very few voices that is speaking out about Hindutva and its threats here in New Zealand. She has done that consistently. And that kind of media construction, which absolutely comes from ignorance, which comes from the lack of research that you would expect journalists to do. And, Kyle, I talk about this again in my writing, and this is quite triggering to the right as well. I talk about this as sort of the white mediocrity, if you will, of discursive spaces, right? So if you look at the nature of journalism itself, there is so much mediocrity that is built into it, where actually one can go about doing a piece like that without investing in the research that is necessary. And part of that is that we don't have the infrastructures to hold that kind of coverage accountable. Just because there isn't that discursive register for us to learn about Hindutva, then to actually do the research to know what it actually is, and then to hold it accountable based on that learning. So that kind of space for deep, critical, reflexive journalism seems to be quite limited.
And I think, as we've said multiple times on this podcast, and a lot of us have just said across social media continuously, there is intent behind that as well. It does not serve class interests among the capital class and the people who hold power. for journalists to be well-resourced and have the capacity to go and do this research, even if they wanted to.
Yes.
And you're unlikely to get people in positions to make these arguments, to be promoted into a position to make these arguments if they're not working within that system in the first place, if they don't already hold a particular set of viewpoints.
Absolutely. And it also feeds into clickbait market logics quite powerfully, right? So that kind of a short piece that is actually fairly sloppily done, fairly under-researched, and you could say that, part of that is the lack of resources, also contributes to then a particular political economy of the market that thrives on speaking to a particular segment of the audience that would sort of be drawn into that. But then you see that there is sort of a direct flow from there into sort of fairly fringe outlets like the Platform or Carl Dufresne's blog.
Less and less fringe, sadly.
Yeah, less and less fringe, absolutely. So there is a continuity there, Carl, the Kyle, which I'm pointing out, in the sense that from mainstream media to sort of these right-wing spaces that are peddling disinformation, there is real continuity. Of course, part of that is the market logic. The other part of that is the whiteness of the settler colonial logic, and they seem to work hand in hand.
Absolutely. And I think we've seen a really horrible example of that in the last week. And we talked about this over the weekend as well. And that's the very clear political hit job being implemented against Wellington Mayor Tory Whanua, where it was picked up, like this idea was picked up and created by people that we know are far-right muckrakers. Yeah. And all the stuff was flying around social media. And for some unknown reason, a whole bunch of producers and reporters just trusted this as being fact and reported on it with a range of details that were assumed to be fact, whereas no one had actually seen the stuff in real life. And then, as you say, this was up on the Platform. There's some stuff on News Talk ZB, and then on every single mainstream outlet as well, although they tried to be somewhat more civil about it, at least in terms of the language they were using. It was, a rather disgusting example of how this works.
And then when you go to an infrastructure like the Platform, then you see this come to full bloom, right? So I think that mapping of that trajectory of that pathway is really interesting because it shows what I would call the investment of the mainstream media in racist logics that feed the far right, And this is the part which is really interesting, right? That part of the neoliberal infrastructure of the media is that media as such play out multiple narratives at the same time. So even as it feeds into this, the same media platforms would run stories on disinformation or on misogyny, right? As if these issues are independent and separate from each other. And part of that is the ideological production of mediated discourses and the kinds of markets they are speaking to. The fact is that there is a market, and the media appeal to that market. The other part of it, I also think, is the absolute lack of anti-racist pedagogy, that when you really consider the kind of callousness of coverage, particularly covering issues that relate to global politics, or the coverage of issues related to Tetiriti, or coverage of, in this instance, Maori women politicians. The underlying investment seems to be to crafting particular narratives that speak to the whiteness of Aotearoa as a settler colony.
And the end result is to serve power. Again, going back to what we were saying earlier, around the way this is used as a tool of erasure to silence different voices. The power in Aotearoa, in the New Zealand state, predominantly arises through a white supremacist colonial structure that it was built on, and arguments about Te Tiriti aside, that clearly is taking a backseat in the formation of our country. These narratives serve that structure. They serve to ensure that structure will continue to propagate unabated. And anything that might be a threat to that is seen as an other.
Yes, and other that must be erased, then, right? And which I think communicatively it also is very interesting in terms of looking at those processes of erasure. I think it's an interesting question to ask in terms of how the other is erased. And what I find quite violent, in fact, is the production of stigmatizing narratives and stigmatizing narratives that reproduce colonial archetypes, archetypes of the primitive other, the savage other, the lazy other. You see how those continue to perpetuate. And at the same time, to actually talk about those portrayals, it seems like, turns one into a racist or being labeled as racist, right? So there is also sort of this portrayal of Aotearoa as sort of a really harmonious settler colonial space where Maori and Pake have figured out the rules of the dance and how it's all harmonious. So for anyone that is talking about actually this kind of violence, then is seen as a threat, but also one that is rendering impure this sort of pure space that is Aotearoa, which again is another coded racist narrative, right? So you see this consistently that all these foreigners, for instance, so migrants, particularly dark-skinned migrants, are not supposed to say anything. We should just be grateful. And for a migrant to point out any of this as bringing an impure politics that is rendering Aotearoa impure and causing all these troubles in Aotearoa.
Yeah, and a really clear example of that is for non-white migrants who happen to say, hey, this isn't that great, or like criticize something. The response will always be, oh, go home then, regardless if they're like first or second or whatever generation. Whereas if you have expat, people from the UK or other groups that helped to colonize New Zealand in the first place, they'll be taken very seriously. Oh yeah, I think we should be more like Britain, or wherever. You very rarely hear the same arguments deployed against them.
Yes, and so this is quite powerful in terms of how the narrative around the migrant is racialized as well, right? So I can't tell you how many times the kind of Twitter trolls I get, they will talk about, hey, you stupid moron, this is not Aotearoa, you're in a different country, this is New Zealand, go back to whatever shithole you came from, right? So that juxtaposition is also quite powerful.
Yeah, it's something that can be really hard to determine where it's coming from as well. It's such a morass out there, and if we're bring social media into it, we've got this whole range, we've talked about this online, this whole range of bots and sock puppets who are clearly coming from somewhere that are doing the work of harassment and abuse alongside the more institutionalized versions of this particular discourse.
Absolutely. And I was just going to say that, Kyle, that on one hand, you have these automated digital spaces that clearly form key resources in this infrastructure of, say, anti-migrant rhetoric. But then you also have institutionalized structures like the platform that will, say, for instance, target an entity like FIAMS, when it issues a statement around Palestine, and then there is an implicit message in there that, you don't really quite fit our culture, that then you go back to wherever you came from because you don't fit our culture. So that kind of activation in that sense very much is also supported financially by actors within Aotearoa that clearly are happy to support these narratives, and there is a market that is feeding into.
Because they see this stuff as a risk to their power base, right?
Yes.
As much as anything else. I mean, I think, we can never forget that they are probably also racist, and that is one of the things driving them to do this. But I think first and foremost, it is this group or these people are a threat to us, either financially or in terms of the amount of power that we hold in these spaces. We need to ensure that they're erased.
And this is part of what I have seen in some of my research is this is part of a global trajectory.
Yes.
So what we are seeing in Aotearoa is not independent of what is happening elsewhere. And this is a point which I think is really important to note, although the right, and particularly the far right, will go to great pains to say that all the stuff is being imported from the US, the critical race theory stuff that is being imported from the US. But that is an example of communicative inversion, which, is the inversion of materiality on its head, because what that discourse reflects is sort of this pattern of attacks on critical race theory, on conversations on racism, justice, power inequities, that sort of form a part of the Bannon-Trumpian universe and clearly have started networking into various Western democracies. If you think about the UK, if you think about Australia, if you think about parts of Europe. And then, of course, in Aotearoa, one would argue that there is a positive investment into this, specifically because perhaps Aotearoa, with its possibilities with Te Tiriti, offers an architecture for resistance, which is why I think it also forms a significant space in terms of targeting of the far right, global far right infrastructure in terms of attempting to silence the possibilities of solidarity, possibilities of anti-racist work.
I always find that particular projection from the right just so absurd, because who do they think is importing the stuff? We don't have any people here. We don't have the money to do this. We don't have the left doesn't have the framework capable of bringing a culture war here. And, it's been shown again and again, the way that this pipeline works. Numerous people have shown how the funding pipeline works from the States or from the UK, how the think tank pipeline works to bring those ideas here. And yet somehow it's just this unknown leftist organization who is bringing the culture war. And alongside that, you have the mainstream media. And this is another one of those little tools they use to uphold hegemonic kind of structures. And that's to use both sides as soon as these kind of things drop, when it's very clear that one of these sides is right out on the fringe as far as its perception of reality goes.
And, the sort of this idea of balance, for instance, in what you're pointing to is this notion of balance in mainstream media reporting. I mean, some of the earliest pieces of work on media analysis I did was right around the US interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what was quite striking when doing that work and publishing it is sort of the investment of the imperial structures, if you will, in ideas of balance that actually worked to further the hegemonic configurations and an entire infrastructure of violence as invasion. And the way that worked is that even as journalists reproduced disinformation in the mainstream, you think about Operation Iraqi Freedom itself, or the invasion of Afghanistan itself, based upon disinformation that were fed through and amplified through mainstream media, then one has to really look at the not just complicity, but the investment of mainstream media in this political economy. And that then really raises questions about sacred cows, if you will, like the idea of balance, because the balance then really is exposed as a mechanism that can sustain disinformation-based propaganda campaigns to the extent that in a media story, you can say that, well, I have just listened to both viewpoints,
Yeah, I'm objective. I'm just putting both viewpoints out there, and the audience can decide for themselves, as if there's not an entire framework trying to influence the audience at any given point, right? It's it's a height of absurdity, and it's really to get into current events with this. It's really gone fully mask off with the genocide in Gaza, because any semblance of balance has just gone out the window. We've seen maybe one Palestinian voice in Aotearoa platformed over the last 8 weeks, among a deluge of people who are platforming Israeli government and Israeli occupation forces propaganda and like outright lies. A lot of the stuff is getting debunked in real time. And yet we have spokespeople showing up in media as if they are an expert or as if they are objective themselves, spreading lies, outright lies over and over again. And the one time a Palestinian voice is platformed, we've also had him on the podcast, Tamim Shaltoni, had his audio edited to remove mention of genocide. Just horrific.
Yes. And, there's so much solidarity with Tamim, and is an important voice here in Aotearoa. It's lovely that you had him on your podcast, Kaya. One of the concepts that I find quite powerful theoretically is the concept of communicative inequality. So inequality in the distribution of communicative resources, all the way from information to decision-making, to participation, to voice. So if we look at that concept and then think about communicative inequality in terms of voice, and then apply that to the question of balance, it sort of unpacks that whole framework of balance, if you will. Because, one can say that in a specific story, I'm balancing it out by having, say, Zionist voices and then a Palestinian voice. But that story itself, in spite of giving that appearance of balance, can work to perpetuate communicative inequality by being oblivious to the communicative inequality that underlies those discursive infrastructures, if you will, in a global scale. So what does it mean to listen to a Palestinian voice here in Aotearoa or globally, vis-a-vis what does it mean to foreground Israeli narratives here in Aotearoa connected to Israeli narratives in other Western democracies globally. So that's sort of at one level. But beyond that then is the question of how balance is performed to delegitimize the voices of the raised colonized margins. And I think that is the process through which particular media stories and then the media architecture overarchingly can become a site for reproducing settler colonial imperial violence, which is that, you bring a Palestinian voice in and then you juxtapose the voice amidst Israeli narratives that are based upon, as you point out, Kyle, say, disinformation, propaganda, and lies. So what that then does to the Palestinian narrative is that it introduces it into a media ecosystem that is removed from the visceral reality of negotiating that occupation. And we are seeing this constantly in terms of, say, for instance, the erasure of the ongoing attacks on hospitals, just to give you one example, of the death of children, the death of infants. And that raises this fundamental question, do we fundamentally inhabit a world where different lives matter differently, where the life of a Palestinian child, for instance, has different value compared to other lives in other Western contexts? And again, mediate that through the idea of balance, that when you have a story that is engaging with the Palestinian voice, but doesn't really engage with this broader context of violence and settler colonial violence and the extreme forms of violence we are seeing, that then actually continues to perpetuate the violence. And that is what I'm describing as whiteness, right? Which is the performance of balance that continues to establish and reproduce hegemonic formations. And in that process, then, even as we say, on one hand, we have heard a Palestinian voice, we are not really listening to that voice. That voice continues to be erased.
And even, in media spaces overseas, which shockingly, even like in the States and in the UK and Canada, are now doing, I hesitate to say better than media here, just by having spokespeople on, like, from NGOs, which we haven't really done here to any useful degree. Even when they have someone on from Doctors Without Borders or the UN, we have had a couple here. I know anyone listening who's like, oh no, we've had the couple on RNZ or whatever. Yes, I know we've had 2 or 3. Well done. But it's a regular thing overseas, right? Even, a horrible man like Piers Morgan has had multiple people on give a Palestinian viewpoint that is far more antagonistic than anything that has shown up in New Zealand media. But every single time over there, when this happens, you get this, do you condemn Hamas though? And they're still saying that 20,000 plus deaths later, like multiple war crimes, like very, very clear war crimes, like incontrovertible evidence that this is a genocidal campaign, an ethnic cleansing campaign. All these NGOs and all these experts who are saying, yes, this is what's happening, like Doctors Without Borders are somehow, also having shade thrown at them for daring to suggest that there are war crimes happening here. Whenever they're showing up on the media, at least they are able to present this viewpoint, but it's being put inside this narrower and narrower antagonistic frame from the reporters speaking to them themselves.
And I agree with you that when we look at coverage, say, for instance, of the heart of empire in the US, I look at sort of the New York Times stories, and you think about the complicity of the New York Times in the imperial project. And yet you have some openings, as you point out, Kyle, because of the presence of civil society voices that are doing this work of witnessing, right? And which is where the witnessing is so important. And that then connects back to the quality of media in Aotearoa, raising the question, what does it then say about the media here? That on one hand, there are clear sources of disinformation that are performing Zionist propaganda. For instance, the narrative of beheaded babies, that narrative is constantly reproduced. So on one hand, those kinds of sources that really raise questions about credibility are being platformed. On the other hand, there really seems to be sort of very limited positioning of sources to offer counterpoints or counter narratives. And I think when you ask that question, I come back, Kyle, again to the other question, which is how does that relate to how systematically media in Aotearoa have portrayed Māori or issues related to Tetiriti, and if there is a pattern here that is continuing to be reproduced. So you have media, for instance, that have offered apologies for their anti-Maori frames and coverage, and then continue to sustain the racist narratives, which I think in many ways raise really important questions about sort of the ideology of whiteness and how built in that is into mainstream media in Aotearoa.
They're very practiced at it, right?
And then the question is, as a communication educator, I think the one thing I wonder about is that what does that mean for media pedagogy, for what we teach our students, for this space to change and for this space to transform. And you see that there is so much investment in maintaining this architecture, if you will, of whiteness, that any kind of conversation of social justice or justice-based reporting produces so much backlash. Or if you think about the public interest journalism funds and the aspects of Tetiriti that were written into the PIJF, and then you have actors like Carl Dufresne, who directly attack that sort of Tetiriti-based components of the public interest journalism fund. And then the framing of that is that, we are losing sort of the objectivity of media, and it's all becoming woke and social justice based. And I think on one hand, one could just look at that and ignore it as some kind of, rant from sort of the right. On the other hand, I think it also points to this ideological investment, if you will, of the media in sort of reproducing particular kinds of narratives that have historically silenced voices of Maori, have historically silenced narratives of colonization, aspects that particularly point to notions of dissent, notions of resistance that don't fit well with this kind of, we are all in harmony, we all get along, Aotearoa is a paradise kind of a story,
Yeah, it's every time we go through a cycle like this, it just seems to uncover more of that internal framework and the way it's mechanized to produce a particular set of outcomes.
Yes.
And I think as resource and capacity of these institutions under neoliberalism get stripped away, the facade is being stripped away as well to a large extent, because stuff just gets sloppier.
And part of this also is sort of how we approach this question of disinformation, I think is really important. I'm uncomfortable with this idea that, disinformation sits in the space of the far right.
It's only on Telegram. It's the only place you'll find it.
Exactly, or on Signal, right? I'm much more interested in who produces disinformation, what are the political economies of disinformation networks, because disinformation by definition is strategic. That means that there is underlying ecosystems of disinformation are political and economic actors that are disseminating the disinformation. And I think that's what makes the question of disinformation really interesting, is when you look at the sort of the role of mainstream media as sources of disinformation, when you look at the role of the state as a source of disinformation, when you look at imperial geopolitics as the source of disinformation, right? I mean, in the context of Israel and Palestine and the ongoing conflict, if you will, and even that framing of this as conflict, is problematic because it's a colonial intervention. But within this context, for instance, if you ask the question of terror and how the narrative of terror is produced, and who is the terrorist, I mean, one of the things I've grappled with, for instance, is, I wrote a blog piece in which I said that, when I woke up witnessing solidarity with, a decolonizing intervention, the way in which that got framed in terms of, and of course, in that blog piece that I'd written, I had gone to great extent at the end to talk about what I mean by decolonization, the idea that we have to critique and interrogate the notion of violence on civilians. We have to look at decolonization as a space for opening up voice infrastructures where the colonized could articulate their agency. But that got framed into the terror narrative. And I think, what I thought really interesting with regard to that is even how the label of terror or terrorist is produced in this sort of disinformation infrastructure is something worth interrogating, including the role of state, the role of state terror and asking questions such as, should states be labeled as terrorist states for perpetuating terror, for their military apparatus perpetuating terror? And I think those kinds of questions that need to be asked, one of the things about disinformation campaigns is that, you see, they foreclose possibilities and they foreclose conversations, right? So because the disinformation then drives the hate such that they limit discursively the possibilities of conversation. So you see Palestinian voices being violently erased. You also see voices of those expressing solidarity. So you talked about NGOs. For many of these NGOs, just documenting the extent of violence turns them into targets of the Israeli propaganda network, if you will, right? That there are arguments made that those NGOs or civil society organizations are supporting terrorists, petitions are raised around that frame. So the goal of all of that is to actually silence voices that raise critical questions and challenge that disinformation infrastructure. So I just want to come back to this idea that disinformation is not just something that happens on the fringe, not just something that happens on platforms like Telegram, but it is part of an infrastructure that works to silence critical questions and critical interrogations of the hegemonic structure.
And when it is in mainstream media, or if it is coming from a state actor, the amplification power of it is just that much stronger. There's some horrible stuff on Telegram, but most people don't see that. I mean, it's bad. I'm not going to
Yes.
And some of the stuff originates there.
Yes.
But particularly with the genocide in Gaza, that's not where it's coming from. It is coming directly from a state actor and their armed forces.
Yes.
Or from Joe Biden, from the podium, from the president, the most quote unquote powerful man in the world, standing up and just spreading just horrific disinformation.
Yes.
And as you say, the purpose is to label everything at odds with that framework as being sympathetic with atrocity, when, the opposite is often true.
Yeah. And I mean, you talk about Biden, Kyle, and I think that when one looks at the US as empire, that's why we need that kind of historic analysis of media frames and media production. I mean, we go back 2 decades and we see Bush, Colin Powell, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and the manufacturing of consent, if you will, to take from Chomsky around the US imperial invasions then. If you go further back into sort of the Cold War frames, you see the active investment in the production of disinformation to drive regime change, for instance, or to destabilize democracies. I mean, you have to think about the birth of neoliberalism, which is sort of Chile, where sort of that is the laboratory of the neoliberal experiment. And if you think about the coup manufactured in Chile by US interventionism, at the heart of that is production of disinformation by state actors. And then if you go further back, then Indonesia, you think about the 1965 genocide in Indonesia, or across the global south in terms of US interventionism in supporting far-right political economic actors. I mean, the state's investment in the production of disinformation and destabilization of democracies, ironically, has been the modus operandi, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, we're not surprised by this at this point. And at some point, I think post Afghanistan and Iraq, they realized that it costs too much to be doing that, and for the most part, they just bomb people and don't talk about it at all. Right. And like the US is bombing people all the time, but you just never hear about it. There are genocides happening everywhere with tacit US support. So sometimes often trained by the Israeli Defense Forces as well. I don't know. Like it's the most ludicrous stuff. But in this case, it's so obvious, it's so clear cut, and I guess due to the nature of that, and the way that the US is so directly tied to Israel, as a funder and business partner, I guess they've had to really step it up again. But I think we often worry about the amount of media literacy among audiences and among the electorate as being able to see through disinformation. But I think people are far more media literate about this stuff than they ever have been previously. Yeah. And for better or worse, platforms like Twitter have helped with that. That's where we're seeing most of the stuff coming out of Gaza.
And that's been so powerful to witness, of course. If you think about platforms like Twitter or Instagram, there is the underlying logic of platform capital. Beyond that, what has been so powerful to witness are the accounts emergent from Gaza documenting the violence. You cannot hide the violence and the scale of the violence. And what has been, for me, so powerful to witness is the work of journalists on the ground. Mm-hmm. You think about the number of journalists that have been killed in Gaza.
There's a reason for that, right? They're killing them for a reason.
Yes, if you can destroy the narrative infrastructure, then you have turned off the lights, right? So you have no register for witnessing the kind of violence that is going on, right? And at the same time, because of those registers of violence, I agree with you that the narrative around the occupation seems to be shifting at a global scale, at least in terms of the kinds of protests you are seeing, at least in terms of challenging the Zionist propaganda that the critique of Israel is anti-Semitism, that is seriously being taken on and debunked. And that is doing something quite powerful, I feel, Kyle, which is that it is opening up more spaces for these conversations. In academic circles, I can see it among colleagues, that there used to be a point of time where academics used to feel really, and I think it continues in many ways, that there is a sense of fear for speaking up and speaking out in solidarity with Palestinians, because your job can be on the line. As we have seen here in Aotearoa, there are attempts at getting recordings of your classroom lectures, for instance, as has happened with...
That's disgusting stuff.
Yes. So there is that real fear, right? But at the same time, I think more and more people are developing that courage because of the acts of witnessing. They are also feeling that, at this point, I have to, in many ways, work through the emotions I feel, including the anxiety, which is real, and the fear about losing my job, which is very real, to speak up. You just think about the story that emerged today in terms of the infants that were left in the hospital.
No words.
Yeah.
Absolutely no words. As far as I know, has barely been covered here.
And at the same time, when you think about it, Kyle, right, that kind of accounting and witnessing is happening. And when you listen to voices of journalists like Motaz and Bishan, they have become in many social media spaces across the globe these journalistic voices for accounting, for witnessing, right? And now you're saying that it's at a point where these journalists are saying, that I'm going off air and I don't know if I'm going to be safe or if I'm going to come back on again or not. And that draws in our affect, our emotions, but it also connects us to these acts of witnessing in that sense. And then it goes back to that broader question, Kyle, about sort of what is the role of journalists and what is the role of journalism, right? So you see journalists facing these tremendous forms of violence, extreme violence, right? This sustained attack on journalistic institutions, if you will. And in spite of that, these journalists doing their work. And then you think about the kind of privilege that safeguards journalists here in Aotearoa that won't even sort of open up a small window of a register to listen to these voices. This inequity in journalistic practices is something also that is becoming very evident,
Yeah, it's, I don't think anyone would say that I'm not antagonistic towards media in New Zealand. I cop to that. I understand that is where I come from. But these last couple of months, I have very little faith in the ability of New Zealand journalistic institutions to reform, given how they've responded to what's happening in Gaza. I don't think I'll ever forget, which outlets, all of them, and which journalists and reporters either refused to platform this stuff or actively platform disinformation. It's just, you don't come back from that. The reality is so clear, and the urgency to engage in journalism and to hold power to account, which should be, it should be what underlies everything that they do. And, I come from a politics and media background, and I understand how these institutions of power and they are meaning-making for hegemonic frameworks, and, no one would be in those roles if they weren't acquiescing to that in the first place. And even then, I would have thought we would have seen better. And maybe that's naivete or some final hope of mine that there was space to move here. But I'm not sure how some of these organizations rebuild trust with their audience at this point.
What you're saying about sort of this 2-month window, if you will, into the nature of journalistic practice shows so much about the investment of journalism here into whiteness, both settler colonialism and imperialism. And I go back to the point you raise about coverage in the UK or coverage in the US, which seems to be moving. And then the question is that what's happening to journalism here in Aotearoa? And I wonder, as time progresses, Kyle, if journalism in Aotearoa will start mirroring some of the narratives that we are starting to see in the US, for instance, emerge now. That's sort of one question I have empirically. The other question I have is in terms of what it means for journalism education and pedagogy, really. Because I think as educators, we really have to grapple with this question of what does it mean to train the next generation of journalists in terms of building their capacities to interrogate power, to witness acts of violence, and to actually take seriously journalistic ethics in terms of listening to voices that are systematically erased by hegemonic structures. I think that, to me, it points to perhaps our feelings as well as media educators and as communication educators, journalism educators, in terms of the kinds of journalists we are training and we are educating, and particular kinds of practices that are perhaps being reproduced, that sort of not creating or building these habits for interrogating power and asking critical questions.
How do you, as an educator, you can put everything there, right? We can train fantastic journalists. But if our media institutions don't want workers who are like that, if part of the hiring process is to make sure that those kind of people aren't on their books, maybe not like with specific intent, but at least insofar as their workflow is or seems to be designed, how do we shift that? How do we get to a place where, I guess from my point of view, the media does its job, and I really struggle to call much of what media does in the current age journalism.
So much of it is copy and paste PR and press releases, isn't it? It is quite sad, actually, to witness that. But, what do you point to in terms of what do we do? I think that's a really interesting question in terms of what do we do with media institutions to hold them to account. And I think that's where I feel, a couple of things. One is that institutions are invested in reproducing themselves. So they are not going to change themselves, right? These are market-driven institutions that will respond to algorithmic logics and investor sensibilities, and then their overarching investment in that ideology of whiteness once again. So I think the way we change that, then if we look at how media reforms have come to be across the globe, is through mobilization, is through protest, is our activism outside of these institutions and doing exactly what you're doing. And I see you doing this on digital spaces, although I'm sure it's not always pleasant for you, right? But to keep on holding them to account and keep on building this counter narrative. I will give you an example of this, Kyle. I was sharing with you that our research team were looking at the media coverage of Operation Iraqi Freedom building up to the invasion and in the first 2 years of it. So we had content analysis based upon framing. Framing theory looks at how media frames are produced, what gets placed into those frames and what gets erased. Now, so based on these content analyses, we had sort of quantifiable data, if you will, of the kinds of biases we see in the media. And then I remember, sharing these findings at, conferences of journalism educators and researchers that also brings in many journalists, and it became a point of real debate because, the people with that journalistic background in professional journalism would look at the findings and be very defensive that no, it is not the job of journalists to do propaganda. And here we had, the data that sort of was pretty robust in pointing out exactly what the frames were. And I think what I found through that experience is building empirically a register for actually documenting what is going on is equally important. And that's where I think it's also our job as researchers, as academics, to continue to document the media frames, and then to partner with activists, with movements, with critical voices like yours to continue to make visible, if you will, the kinds of frames and the kinds of effects that these frames produce. Now, the other part of it, I also think, is that sort of there's real room for building progressive media and progressive infrastructures. I mean, we see this with the coverage of Gaza, right? That in spite of the mainstream media blackout largely in Western democracies, we still happen to get the accounts of what was happening in Gaza. Yes. And that was through simple architectures like Twitter and Instagram. And that shows you the power today of journalists to build platforms and spaces that can document and that can witness. I mean, in India, for instance, in the face of the kind of Hindutva politics where you see Islamophobia deeply institutionalized through state and media structures, where I find the power of resistance is in public journalism, in people's journalism, in citizen journalism, in community radio. So I guess the other question is that what does that mean to build robust, grassroots-based mediated spaces, how to find funding models that will sustain those spaces. I think that's a really interesting question. I don't think that we have to keep coming back to these institutional structures. There are ways in which we can bypass these institutions and create alternative logics. I've seen, for instance, the work we have done with, Dalit oppressed caste women farmers in Telangana in South India. And, they are challenging their BT cotton and sort of the infrastructure of BT cotton that has shaped agrarian farming practices, and sort of challenging that with sustainable farming practices rooted in indigenous traditions and ways of knowing. And the women point out that, part of that is changing the narrative and changing sort of the sources of information in terms of what is spread on mainstream radio as advertising that is targeting these communities. So for them, the community radio becomes the way then to tell the story of seed and seed sovereignty. I find that example quite powerful because you have here in the global South, a community of landless, oppressed caste, women farmers, and they are able to shift the narrative, not only within that farming community, but as a register then for a global movement called the Millet Network, which is an alternative farming movement, And what that story tells us is that if we want to imagine decolonizing alternatives, or if you want to imagine alternatives that sort of offer different kinds of political economies to the mainstream media, there can be lots of possibility.
Yeah, that's it's a really fantastic example, and thank you for sharing it with us. I think we sometimes forget that the stuff is possible. It's not as insurmountable as it seems. It's pretty bleak. It's not great, but there are ways forward. I think that's.
I mean, you're doing this podcast, and that's an example of what is possible. Here we are sitting down and offering a full-on critique through sort of a fairly, what one might argue is a sort of elaborate conversation, right? Because we are also not afforded this kind of luxury within particular kinds of media ecosystems, if you will, right?
Absolutely. No, I think that's probably a really good place to leave it before we get onto the next hour-long track of conversation, because there's so much in this space to talk about.
Yes, and thank you for this important work that you're doing, Kyle. I mean, I think that this example of this space that you are creating with this podcast is the sort of things we want to teach students of journalism and students of media, that there are possibilities that you can craft here now, and you can work toward building things. So thank you.
Thank you, Mohan. Really appreciate that. And there are plenty of other talented people out there who make much better stuff than we can. So everyone, get to it. Mohan, if people want to find you online or find your work, where can they do that?
So they can find me on Twitter at MJ Dutt. That's my handle, MJDUTT. They can also find me on the CARE Facebook page, which is the Facebook page for the Center for Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation, or CARE. If you just type that in on your Google browser, that will take you to the Facebook page. And CARE also has a YouTube channel where we host a lot of our talks with the idea of generating these public registers. So you're welcome to follow us on any of those platforms and subscribe to those platforms.
Fantastic. Thank you so much once again, Mohan.
Thank you so much. Here.
And thank you to our audience. Really appreciate you listening through this one. If you've enjoyed it, share it around. I think we can never have enough critique of powerful institutions, whether that's political institutions or media institutions or business institutions, and the list goes on. Find us on Twitter We've got the Patreon link in the summary as usual if you want to help support independent media. And yeah, let your friends and family know there's independent media out there, which is trying its best to speak truth to power in this more and more absurd age that we find ourselves in. We'll be back on the weekend with current events. We'll catch you then.
If artifice is art, then I'm living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's upon now. It's paved with good intentions, and I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they criticize the cost we ought to stay. 'Cause I live amongst the people every day in this vindictive, forgetful fucking race.